this, but we always have new people, so I'll repeat it. About the way I'm going through this study. Proverbs is a particular book. I like to preach through books kind of verse by verse. That's sort of the steady diet I try to go for. And one of the reasons is because I try to remove as much subjectivity from my soapboxes as I can. If I'm preaching through books, then the next verse I have to preach is the next verse in line. I don't just sit around thinking, what does Parker Windle want to preach? But so it's really easy when we did the Romans series and went verse by verse through Romans. But when you come to Proverbs, it's a little bit more challenging because the Proverbs don't always go together. It's more of a collection of Proverbs. And so I had to kind of think through, how am I going to remove my sort of soapbox ideas and try to focus on, in a more objective way, what I'm preaching. So what I did was I took the Proverbs and categorized each one. Yes, 31 chapters of them. And I took the categories that were the most represented and determined what sermons I was going to preach based on those subjects. So in that way, I'm not preaching every single verse in Proverbs, but I'm covering the major topics according to volume, right? So today, the topic that we're covering is I'm combining the idea of work and the verses about laziness and slothfulness and that whole theme. So we'll be looking at that specifically today as we get back into the book of Proverbs. So let's go to the Lord in prayer as we think through this. Lord, help us to understand and rejoice in a Christian view of work and vocation. And Lord, I pray that as a result that we will not see this teaching as burdensome, but as joyful. And we ask all these things in Christ's name. Amen. How many of you have ever heard of the singer Dave Matthews? Anyone? There's a few of the Americans, right? So I thought he was like a global brand, and I found out he's not. But I was a teenager in the 90s, and this guy was huge in America in the 90s. Now, he's kind of a top-tier guitarist. Like, he's a really talented musician. When I was learning to play guitar, we kind of separated the good people from the bad people if they knew how to play Dave Matthews songs. I was never able to play Dave Matthews songs. So he's good. And he had this song in 1993 called Ants Marching, which is one of the more famous songs that he wrote. And, it's a negative view of the ant, okay? The idea is that people in their sort of, to use a French expression, métro boulot dodo, the big city, getting up, going to work, coming back home, they're the ants marching. And all the little ants are marching, red and black antennas waving, this song. And it's the idea of just kind of mindless going to routine work, and life is passing you by in this. It's a very negative view of the ant. That may be kind of a pop culture view of ant, but here in the book of Proverbs, the ant is a positive metaphor. It's actually, you can do a lot worse than being an ant. In Proverbs here is saying that you should go to the ant as an example of what to do, not what not to do. So here we see the Proverbs rebuking my friend Dave Matthews, and I found some interesting point about ants. I took about 30 minutes and watched an ant documentary this week in preparation, and it was pretty interesting stuff I found out. Did you know there are 1 quadrillion ants in the world? Quadrillion. I didn't know what that was, so I looked it up. It's 1 with 15 zeros, if you were counting. There is no danger in the world currently of ant extinction. There are lots of them. They're abundant. They're a prosperous people, the ants. And they are known for their work. That's what's been going on here. Their work ethic. They have teamwork. They work as a team. It's really fascinating, some of the things about them. They can lift 50 times their body weight. But if they're together, They can lift like just ridiculous amounts of weight, compared to how small that they are. And one of the other interesting things I found out is that they in their community they work according to roles. Like the scripture teaching about the church, about the body, in 1 Corinthians 12, that each body, spiritual gifts, each one has their gifts. The ants are kind of the same way. They work on that basis. You just see little ants walking around, but they know their jobs. They categorize them into inside ants and outside ants. The inside ants will feed and clean the queen. They will maintain the tunnels in the ant hill. They will keep the nest warm. They will store the food that is brought in. There's even like kind of guard ants that keep the colony safe. Did you know ants fight each other? There's rivalries between the different ant hills. And there are undertaker ants that remove the dead ants out. And so these indoor ants have these roles, but then there's the outdoor ants. And they're the hunters, the gatherers. They go and find materials and bring it back for the construction of the anthill. They're all very specialized, but they're all just kind of get on with their work every day, right? You don't see sort of existential crises because I have to be the ant that keeps the colony safe. No, everybody just does their role. And the Bible says you should actually look to that as an example of good work. The metro bulo dodo, the routine, is positively presented. The diligence here. Consider the ant, church. Now, there's lots of verses, and I'm going to try to summarize them as much as I can in Proverbs, and then we're going to get to a New Testament application and gospel motivation as well. But I want you to see the reality of work here and try to paint the full picture, because I know a lot of you might be a little skeptical about this. You're saying all this nice stuff about work, but you don't know what my job's like. I know that's coming up, and the reality is that toil is hard. Work is hard. Nobody's going to pretend that it's not. We know that after the fall, that one of the curses was that work would be harder, that the thorns would come up from the ground, and it was going to make your toil more toilsome. Now, work existed before the fall. Work is not a result of sin, but work is harder after sin, and I think we can recognize that. And one of the verses I thought was interesting, 14:4, where there is no oxen, the manger is clean, but abundant crops come by the strength of the ox. In other words, work is messy. It'll make your life messy, but it's necessary, because that is how the abundance is going to come. And what abundance mean, we're going to see throughout a lot of verses here. And so one of the positives is this term, the diligent. We've seen in Proverbs before, they use these names, these labels. There's positive and negative labels. The positive label that we see often in the Proverbs for this idea is the diligent, which is often contrasted with the lazy person, or what we'll see later, the sluggard. But there are positive promises that go to the diligent. Now, when I say promises, they're positive proverbs. Proverbs give general truths. It's not saying, hey, if you work, you will for sure be rich one day. It's not saying that. But it's a general truth saying, if you work, the natural, normal thing is that you're going to have abundance from it, that you're gonna reap what you will sow. Right? And it's not a firm promise that it will always happen that way, just as you planned, but it's the generally true principle that work produces. In this case, we'll see a few things. Work produces wealth. It says a slack hand causes poverty, but the hand of the diligent makes rich. Whoever is slothful will not roast his game, but the diligent man will get precious wealth. The plans of the diligent lead surely to abundance, but everyone who is hasty only comes to poverty. Again, it's a reap what you sow kind of mentality. Work hard produces good fruit from the work that you do. We also see another positive for the diligent. 12 verse 14 is satisfaction. From the fruit of a man's mouth, from the fruit of his mouth, a man is satisfied with good, and the work of a man's hand comes back to him. Satisfaction. Many of you probably experienced this with a job well done. Oftentimes in ministry, I often feel like, oh man, I worked all day long. I'm super tired at the end of the day, and I look back and think, what did I even accomplish? Like, where is sort of the tangible fruit from what I did? And so sometimes it's really nice for me to, and I know there's always fruit, but you don't always see it. But when you see it, it's really helpful. One of my favorite things is when you go on a mission trip and you get to do the kind of construction work kind of thing. And that kind of work, you really, okay, there was no wall there this morning. Now there is a wall there. And it's very nice. There's a satisfaction that comes from seeing the work of your hands. And so that's what this Proverbs is saying, is one of the advantages is you get to experience that satisfaction. Another is freedom. Now, 12:24 says it this way. It says, the hand of the diligent will rule, while the slothful will be put to forced labor. There's this comparison with both freedom and wealth versus poverty and kind of forced labor or slavery, however that would be caused, according to work. Now, I want to say the Bible does not oversimplify poverty. It is not saying that laziness is always the reason for poverty. We know that that's not true. There's many injustices in the world that cause poverty. But what it is saying is that laziness will cause poverty, that it might be the cause of poverty. You see, it's not always the cause of poverty, but it can cause poverty. And it's saying that on the other side, you're able to reap what you sow. When you're out working, you're going to have the fruit. It says in the terms of the positive motivations, why do you want to be a hard worker? In 1626, a worker's appetite works for him, and his mouth urges him on. So he wants to get what he needs. He wants to provide for his family. He wants his daily bread, so he goes out and works for it. That's a positive motivation for work here. But another thing, and I think this is important because it doesn't stop. The reason you work is not only for yourselves. There is and we're going to see this, a community social aspect to the importance of work. And in the righteous man, as opposed to the sluggard, he gives because he wants to give back to others. The desire of the sluggard kills him, for his hands refuse to labor. All day long he craves and craves, but the righteous gives and does not hold back. This is a very New Testament concept as well. You work hard, not for just personal gain, but also for the good of society and for the good of the church and for the good of the mission of God, and so that you can give. You get so that you can be generous. There's a lot about this kind of laziness being contrasted with work, but there's also a lot of verses that concern wise and unwise work. Not if you work or don't work, but how you work. And so there's 8 verses I want to show you on this point. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read all the verses. We're going to read them together, and then I'm going to make some observations about them. But I want to read them first just so you see my observations are coming from the text and not just my opinion, right? So what we see here first, in 12:11, whoever works his land will have plenty of bread, but he who follows worthless pursuits lacks sense. Notice the second verse is almost the same, even though it's, several chapters later. Whoever works his land will have plenty of bread, but he who follows worthless pursuits will have plenty of poverty. So one of them addresses sort of the character of the person, and the other is kind of the results of the consequences of worthless pursuits or empty pursuits. Wealth, in 13:11, wealth gained hastily will dwindle, but whoever gathers little by little will increase it. Next. Whoever is greedy for unjust gain troubles his own household, but he who hates bribes will live. Next, verse 20-21. An inheritance gained hastily in the beginning will not be blessed in the end. 28:20. A faithful man will abound with blessings, but whoever hastens to be rich will not go unpunished. Seeing a theme here about haste? 28:22, a stingy man hastens after wealth and does not know that poverty will come upon him. 28:16, a ruler who lacks understanding is a cruel oppressor, but he who hates unjust gain will prolong his days. Now, a few observations about what we just read. One, wise work involves diligence. Diligence. As opposed to the get rich quick schemes of the world, the positive metaphor here is the farmer. It's not that you have to be a farmer to be a diligent worker. It's that the farmer is an example of what we should be. And it is that consistent commitment, that cultivating, that every single morning we get up and do the same thing. The ants are marching, and that is a good thing. Because the continual commitment of the farmer produces a fruit. Routine is good. It is the long, faithful, consistent work that produces the good crops. It's the hasty work that is dangerous. It says also in these verses that wise work brings benefits. We saw such phrases as they will prolong your days, that you will have plenty of bread, that it is good that you live the consistent life of being an ant, of looking to them because it brings benefits. The ants are not without what they need in the winter. On the other side, get-rich-quick schemes and scams are unwise. They're called worthless pursuits or empty pursuits in these verses. One of the good commentators says it this. It says, in view are ventures or gambles that do not involve hard work and or contribute to the commonwealth, not merely to idleness. So again, this idea, there are people who sort of win the lottery. But there's a lot of times when those lottery winners are poor not long afterwards because they have not kind of developed these habits that come with the prosperity that they have just recently gotten. It is unwise to seek after this, and many people wait their whole life for their ship to come in while the faithful ants are building the nest, while the farmers who are out toiling every day. It can be true in ministry too. Ministry, if we're talking about cultivating people's hearts, that takes time. It takes consistency. It takes diligence. And we should avoid, as a church, get-rich-quick schemes that we're just going to, hey, we're going to transform the world in an instant. Go to the ant church. Be consistent and diligent in your witness. Preach the gospel every day. Right? It is a consistent farmer image that we're looking at here. We're out toiling in his fields, and the laborers are few. But not only are they unwise, these get-rich-quick schemes, they're also immoral. Here, it says in these verses that it's this idea that it causes trouble for those you love. People who spend their whole life on this unwise investment, thinking that they're going to get rich quick, and all they end up impoverishing their family. And it even says in one verse that this hastiness, it says, a faithful man will abound with blessings, but whoever hastens to be rich will not go unpunished. There's a punishment that comes from this kind of mentality. We're not looking at the home run attempts. We're looking at a consistent daily routine of just hard work. Commitment, cultivation. There's consequences to laziness as well. There's a lot of verses about this. I couldn't resist this image in my great ant documentary that I watched. We see that there is the ants will hunt the slug. Did y'all know this? I mean, the slug is like enormous compared to the ant. But the slug is very lethargic and slow, and it doesn't move, and the ants get on that thing. And they cover them up, and that slug has sort of protective coating around it and all these kind of things. But eventually they get through in their diligence, and they eat that thing. They take that thing back to their anthill, and it feeds everybody. Feeds a lot of people because it's so big, this slug. There's consequences to being the sluggard. You know, a few weeks ago, I had a sermon on Proverbs where I talked about the three negative terms, the big three, which was the simple, the fool, and the scoffer, the three biggest negatives. But if I were to take the fourth most used negative word in the Proverbs, it would be the word sluggard. It is used a lot, a lot in it. It is a problem in the Proverbs. It has to do with this idea of laziness. Now we see there are consequences for this. In chapter 12:24, the hand of the diligent will rule, while the slothful will be put to forced labor. We saw that one earlier. They'll never getting gain in 13 verse 4. The soul of the sluggard craves and gets nothing, while the soul of the diligent is richly supplied. The contrast to the sluggard there is the diligent, the routinely active person, the metro bulo dodo, the ant that is marching. In 20 verse 13, there's I don't have this one up here, but it is against too much sleep. It says, love not sleep, lest you come to poverty. Open your eyes and you will have plenty of bread. So it's the idea of just laying around doing nothing. Now, one of the more interesting kind of groups of verses that I saw, it's a couple of verses, is the link to closed doors and lack of opportunities. You can sit your whole life saying, why haven't I had my opportunity? And what the Proverbs is saying is that oftentimes you don't get the opportunity because you're over there in bed like a sluggard. It says when you get out is when you find the opportunities. And in 15:19 it says the way of the sluggard is like a hedge of thorns, but the path of the upright is a level highway. Right? So let me give you an example of this. About 5 years ago last week, we planted EIC Turn. And celebrating its 5th anniversary this week. They had a lovely party. It was so encouraging seeing all the group there. But on that same day where Turn is celebrating its 5th anniversary, we have the birthday of EIC Rive Gauche. And if 5 years ago, when we started thinking about a next church plant, we had zero resources. We didn't have the resources to do what we had done. Okay, we didn't know how Turn was going to survive, to be honest. We are so thankful that it has. We have seen God just bless it. But we thought it was right to think about a third church. We think that there's way more people that need the Jesus in Paris than two English-speaking Emmanuel International churches can reach. So we want to plant more. And although we had no resources, what we did have was some time, and we were able to just be like ants and go work. And so what we did, we had 2 feasibility studies. Some of the people who were in those studies are in this room. We did a study out at Marne-la-Vallée at Disneyland. We did a study at Cité Universitaire in the southern part of town. And the study was, what needs to happen in order to plant a church here? Is there a need for a church here? What can we do? What do we need to be praying for? What do we need to be looking for? And it was during this time where we went out to Marne-la-Vallée, and we were interviewing a great French church out there who was looking for strategic partnerships. We were seeing the multitudes of English speakers who were miles and miles away from an English-speaking church, and we were just totally convinced that we needed a church there. But in that interview, again, not having any idea how a third church could happen, we heard that one of the guys there told us about someone, this guy named John Hugh Tate. I didn't know who John Hugh Tate was, but they did. And when they told me about John Hugh Tate, and they said, oh, look, this guy had lived in France before. He's a Harvard grad. He planted a church in Mississippi. He's got a lot of pastor experience, and he's told us he wants to come to France. Whoa. Wow. Well, I got on the phone with John Hugh Tate, and the snowball started going down the hill, didn't it? You see, it's just the work that we were doing where we found the open door. You see? You're out there doing, and then all of a sudden you realize God's doing. You see, God is working while we're working. See, it's all God's work anyway. And work always is supposed to be going back up to Him. And the sluggard who never gets out of their bed is not going to see what God is doing. But the upright here finds a level highway. The sluggard, on the other hand, misses the opportunities. You have this interesting verse, 19:24. The sluggard buries his hand in the dish and will not even bring it back into his mouth. The food is there. He sticks his hand in the food and he's too lazy to bring it to his mouth. Right? The sluggard is the opposite. The opportunities are right there staring them in the face, and they won't move. Be the one who has the open highway, the one who's out there doing the work of the Lord. We see consequences for laziness. It leads to poverty, slothfulness. In 19:15, cast into a deep sleep, and an idle person will suffer hunger. The sluggard does not plow in the autumn. He will seek at harvest and have nothing. In all toil there is profit, but mere talk only leads to poverty. We see that the sluggard has excuses. There's always an excuse for the sluggard. There's two very similar verses here in 22:13. So that's the next slide. The sluggard says, there's a lion outside, I shall be killed in the streets. And then this is a different verse. The sluggard said, there's a lion in the road, there is a lion in the streets. I can't go out and do work because I'm afraid. Something will get me, something will go wrong. I can't give myself to that. Fear keeps us from working. In 26:15, the sluggard is, again, kind of a repetitive verse here. It's a different verse than the earlier one. The sluggard buried his hands in the dish. It wears him out to bring back to his mouth. It's too tiring to seize on this opportunity. And we also see there's this idea of the sluggard being fixed in his comfort zone in 26:14. As the door turns on its hinges, so does a sluggard on his bed. The sluggard is bound to the hinge. He can't go learn new things. He can't go and do new opportunities because he's only stuck on the hinge. That's the way of the sluggard. There's a lot of excuses for the sluggard, but at the end of the day, the sluggard does damage not only to themselves, but as we often see in the Proverbs, there is social damage done by unwise and sinful behavior. It not only affects you. 10:5, he who gathers in the summer is a prudent son, but he who sleeps in the harvest is a son who brings shame. There's shame to the family in laziness. Like 10:26, like vinegar to the teeth and smoke to the eyes, so the sluggard is to him who sends them. 18:9, whoever is slack in his work is a brother to him who destroys. Is a brother to him who destroys. It is destructive to not work. You're not doing your part. The service that someone else needs, that God has created you to supply, is not being received. Now, this brings us to the New Testament. And thinking of a theological view on vacation, and it needs to be said today, because there's a lot going on about work in our culture, isn't it? There are strikes. There are protests all around. What do we think about work? Now, I want to be careful of not stepping too much into the politics, because I'm not versed enough to have a strong opinion on these particular politics of this particular situation. But I've been in Paris long enough to know a Parisian view of work. And generally speaking, what I hear when I talk to people, and one thing that I hear a lot is this idea. In all of the views about vacation, right? And there's tons of vacation. There's more vacation in France than anywhere else in the world, I think, right? And I'm not saying that it's all bad, all right? So don't hear me say that. But what I don't like, and what I believe is not Christian, is when you say, I work so I can go on vacation because I want to live. And when you say things like that, vacation is life. Work is what you do so that you can live. That's not Christian. Work is an important part of life. It's vital. The Lord worked for 6 days, and on the Sabbath he rested. But 6 of them, God worked. And he created human beings to do the same in his own image. You subdue the earth. You are sub-creators, and the work that you do is to contribute to this world and to human flourishing. It is part of our life. It's an important part of our life and part of the reason God created us. He created us to be like Him. This was a very important part of the Reformation. Uh, when when people like Luther and Calvin, when they were talking, one of the problems they had with the Catholic view of that time was this separation between holy callings and sort of secular callings. And the idea was if you had a holy calling, if you were like a monk or a nun, or you spent all day praying, but if you were a farmer or a shoemaker, these were just sort of secular, less holy things. But what the reformers were saying was they used that word vocation, which means calling. Every single job is holy because God has called you to do it. If you are a shoemaker, God has called you to make excellent shoes. And that farmer is going to be very happy when you make excellent shoes because he's going to use those shoes to grow your food that you're going to put at your table. And we all contribute in the good work we do for the sake of each other. It is a calling. God flourishes the human race through good work. We work because God works. The Spirit of God in the Old Testament. You don't see that phrase as much in the Old Testament. You see it some, but not as much as the New. But one of the places you find it in the Old Testament is in Leviticus. And the Spirit of God is empowering people to do wood cutting, to work in metals and gold in order to build the temple. There's artisan work and artistry. It's not always talking about just being a priest and being a nun. It's talking about good, skilled labor. And the Spirit of God is flourishing the world through these things, through the things you guys do. One interesting passage in the New Testament is 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 17. I have it up here. It says, only let each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him and which he has called him. This is my rule in the churches. Your metro bulo dodo is a calling. It's a vocation. And just because it's routine does not mean it's not holy. Just because it's done every day does not mean that it's unimportant. We've seen the effects of when a strike happens and, let's just stop having transportation. Well, who's affected by that? Everyone. Every single person is affected by that when just one group decides we're not going to do our jobs. When Calvin, the reformer, talked about this, he used this idea of a sentry post in our calling. This is the place God has set you up to watch over. This is, and we use this word a lot in the church, stewardship. Your metro bulo dodo is your sentry post. You are going to be doing your job, and because you're doing your job, humans will flourish. You're doing your part. You're part of the whole. And then in Colossians 3, we just see a very straightforward verse about it. Whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not men. Church, who is your boss? Who is your boss in this verse? Who are you disobeying when you're the sluggard? The Lord is your boss. One of the most prosperous fast food chains in the United States is Chick-fil-A. I don't know if y'all seen this, but they have an interesting reputation in the U.S. But I saw this study that was done from 2019. Chick-fil-A has been ranked the #1 fast food chain in America 4 years in a row at the time. I don't know what it is now, but the report said this is while the company knows how to make good chicken sandwiches, there is more to their success. Chick-fil-A invests in their employees through servant leadership, which is the real secret to their success. According to the study, servant leaders place, listen to this, see if this sounds like any Bible verses you know. Servant leaders place the good of their followers above their own self-interest and emphasize follower development. Chick-fil-A exemplifies this concept in many ways through many different servant leadership characteristics. If you've been to a Chick-fil-A, you've seen this. It's remarkable. Yes, they're like McDonald's. They're everywhere. But every single one you go in, you find the same servant culture. The employees going the extra mile to make you feel welcome, to make you feel appreciated, and you get the sense that those who work there just have a joy about it. And it says here, they place the good of their followers above their own self-interests. Well, that's just Philippians chapter 2, isn't it? That's what happens in the church. You look not only to your own interest, but also the interests of others. Why do you do that in Philippians 2? Because Jesus did. That's what led him to the cross, isn't it? Not looking to his own self-interest, but the interests of others, who's willing to lay down his life as a sacrifice for our sins in service to us. Chick-fil-A is run by Christians, and this has led them to think about how they're going to serve the world in a Christian way, to bring good to everyone who walks through that doors, to contribute to human flourishing through chicken sandwiches and encouraging words. We all are part of this, right? Our work impacts others. Our laziness impacts others. If I'm going to pray a prayer today, Jesus taught me to pray by saying, give us this day our daily bread. Right? I got daily bread here. How is God going to answer that prayer? Give me this day my daily bread. That's true. In the Bible, we see sometimes manna from heaven can fall down and he can miraculously do that. I have never eaten manna from heaven. I normally go over to the boulangerie for my bread. So how does God answer my prayer? Give us, Lord, our daily bread. Well, somebody at that boulangerie did a great job. They got up this morning and they cooked this bread. But it's not that simple, because where'd they get the materials to cook this bread? It didn't just pop up in their store, did it? No. Some farmer somewhere had to put all this together. But when that farmer did all of their hard work, it didn't just magically teleport from one place to another, did it? Somebody had to have a truck. And somebody had to drive that truck and transport it. But in order to do that, somebody had to make that truck. And so there's lots of engineers and lots of creative minds that went into the idea of making these trucks. But they couldn't do it with all the administrative infrastructure of a CEO overseeing the process and of the accountants measuring all of the payrolls and all these kind of things. There's a whole thing behind that truck. And that truck wouldn't have got here without gas, who we're thankful for all the Total people in the room. There are, off-sea platforms that our people are working in order to make sure that we have this gas so that the truck that somebody made can have the gas in order to bring the wheat in order to get to the boulangerie, and the boulangerie, or even there's a middleman, maybe they go to another kind of store or whatever to get it. And how did God answer, give us, Lord, our daily bread? By the way, all those people I mentioned, there's an education system that taught them how to do all those things. Give us, Lord, our daily bread comes from people. You see, the Lord works through our work. Humans flourish through good toil, through metro, bulo, dodo. And this is our contribution to the world. This is something that we take pride in because it is, as the scriptures say, a calling from the Lord. And he is ultimately the one we answer to. But the great news, we have a lot to be thankful for, don't we? I do have my daily bread. I never doubt to have it. When all the little ants are marching, all the little ants are flourishing.